Hello all, today we're going to be talking about computer-mediated communication and social support, testing the effects of using CMC on support outcomes, by Rains, Brunner, Akers, Pavlich, and Goktas. If you'd like to read the paper for yourself, look in the description for a link. Before we get into the meat of the paper, I'd first like to define what I think the authors mean by computer-mediated communication, since they never formally define it. CMC, as I'll call it from now on, refers to any kind of communication done through a computer. This could be through instant messaging software like WhatsApp and Apple Messages, blogs, social media like Facebook and Twitter, Reddit, etc. Though for the purposes of this paper, I do not think the authors are considering video chatting and digital calling. Prior research has found that communication can help manage uncertainty and foster a sense of control over one's life. It has also been proposed that social support could serve as a buffer between stressful events and the body's response to said events. Social support has been further linked to improved coping with uncertainty or the emotional consequences of a stressor. So first, let's look at why people might use CMC. For one, it's really easy and a lot of people do it. Some have theorized that CMC might benefit social interactions since the reduction in social cues allows for selective presentation. People have greater intentionality in how they present, so they can show their best or worst side as the situation may permit. Users could also idealize support givers, which might improve the benefits. And finally, CMC might help people focus on their own stressor, and a result might more easily come to a successful resolution. On the other hand, those same reduced social cues might make message of support less impactful. A number of studies to date have shown little to no positive association of CMC in the outcomes we care about. It could be that the type of support message delivered changes how effective such messages are. Informational support has been shown to be particularly effective for dealing with things perceived as controllable, whereas emotional support has been shown to be more effective for dealing with stressors perceived as less controllable. So based on all the aforementioned prior work, the authors made 3 firm hypotheses and 1 research question. Research questions are used kind of like inductive hypotheses. There's something the authors think might be the case, but they don't have enough prior research backing them to be considered a full hypothesis. Another term for this kind of statement is an exploratory hypothesis. In simple terms, they predicted first that CMC delivered support messages will either be better or worse than in vivo delivered support messages. They also predicted that informational support messages will cause better outcomes than emotional support messages. Their research question is that message type might moderate the effect of CMC versus in-person on emotional well-being. I'd like to talk about undergraduate samples for a bit. They are particularly common in psychology research because they're cheap and easily available. It is quite common to even require undergraduates to participate in studies as part of their introduction to psychology classes. Despite all these benefits, there are some serious drawbacks. Undergraduate samples tend to be richer and wider than the average populace, so any conclusions drawn from such samples need to be taken with that caveat. I find it kind of concerning that the authors didn't even mention the ethnicity breakdown of their sample. This leads me to suspect that it was extremely homogeneous. Onto the experiment's design. They used a 2x2 setup such that there were 2 CMC conditions and 2 in-person conditions. There were also 2 emotional support conditions and 2 informational support conditions, such that you see this condition matrix. There's a pretty basic experimental sign in that it allows you to test interactions and isolate the effects of the, in this case, 2 factors you're interested in. By nature, this experiment is what's called a fully between subjects design because the participants do not participate in multiple conditions. The main advantage of this is that you don't have any spillover effects between conditions, but the main disadvantage is that you need to recruit more people. The participants were brought into the study by Research Assistant 1, who would escort them into a room with a computer or a room with Research Assistant 2. The participant would then engage in an interview on their anxiety regarding finding a job after graduation with RA2, either through the computer or face-to-face as the condition may be. RA2 would either give informational support or emotional support in response to the participants' concerns. I will note that RA2 would always be of the same gender as the participant, just to control for any effects that having someone of a different gender than you may have. The interview consisted of 8 scripted questions and 8 scripted responses to the participants' answers. Here we can see an example of one of the questions and the 2 possible responses RA2 could give. Following the interview, RA1 would then bring the participant into a different room with a computer where they would complete a follow-up survey. The first few measures included are shown here, with the rest on the next slide. Find a few things here concerning. The Career Search Self-Efficacy Measure is a 4-factor, 50-item measure, and they only pick 2 items from each factor. The factors themselves vary in length from 5 to 14 items, so they're not selecting equally from said factors. Also, this shortened version has never been peer-reviewed, so we don't know anything about its validity. You'll also notice that all the other measures are quite short, which means that the scores from them are going to be a lot more noisy, which reduces power. Power is your ability to detect a fact, assuming there is one. I'm not sure why they decided to use such a short follow-up survey, other than that they were concerned about how long it would take to complete. Still, with software like Qualtrics, adding extra items doesn't add that much extra time in terms of the participant's total time load. In addition, the authors included a couple manipulation checks, but I will save the whole topic of such items for another video. And now results. Participants in the CMC condition were found to be more worried about finding a job than those in the in vivo condition, but the effect size was quite small, partial eta squared of 0.05. Effect size is a measure of how meaningful a given effect is. In this case, eta squared describes the amount of variance in your dependent variable that can be explained by your independent variable. So, since eta squared was 0.05, the difference between in vivo and CMC explained 5% of the total variation in worry. I should note that in this and all the other analyses I will present, there were no significant interactions. Also, error bars are my own self-calculated 95% confidence intervals with the means based on information given in this paper. In vivo was found to be better than CMC, but the effect size was also quite small, eta squared of 0.05. There were no significant differences found in self-efficacy. Again, no significant differences in how caring the participants found RA2, nor in how knowledgeable RA2 is perceived to be, nor in how much the participants liked RA2. So the authors claim that CMC is inferior to face-to-face support in giving because of their 2 significant findings. However, their sample size was quite small, average of 20 per group, and the effect size of their 2 significant findings were also quite small. The authors do thankfully acknowledge this, but they then say that it's not a deal breaker because of their 2 significant findings. I do not find this statement convincing, especially in light of the revelations of the replication crisis. Goofy things happen in small sample sizes, and underpowered studies have a greater chance of finding something spurious. I read no evidence of doing any kind of power analysis, so I did a little calculation of my own. If I wanted to replicate this study, given the effect size of their strongest effect, I'd need a sample size of about triple what they had to have an 80% chance of detecting said effect. In essence, I really want to see that properly powered replication. The authors note some further limitations that I think are worth mentioning. The interviews were highly scripted and structured, which leads to great internal validity, but that does limit how well the participant experience mimics real life. The interviews could have been too short, but the authors felt that lengthening the interaction would only affect the participant ratings of their interviewer. I'm not super familiar with informational processing theory, so I'm not going to comment further on that. First and foremost, I want to see a replication of this study. For reasons I've discussed already, I'd also like to see a similar experiment run in a population that isn't undergraduates. One interesting theoretical direction to further explore is how CMC and in vivo delivered support fare against no support at all. Assuming CMC is worse than in person, it could be that CMC is still a lot better than nothing, and maybe video conferencing is as good as in-person communication. Especially in these social distancing times, that should be a fairly natural quasi-experiment to run. It'd also be cool to see some longer-term longitudinal studies. Maybe one instance doesn't result in CMC being better or worse than face-to-face communication, but over time, continued use of one over the other could lead to differences in overall well-being. Another interesting direction would be to see if age cohort moderates the difference between CMC and in vivo. Maybe young people who grew up on the internet don't experience a difference, but older folks who did not do. Well, that's all I've got for now. Like, share, and subscribe. And if you've got a paper you'd like me to break down, let me know in the comments.